Smell nice, Yogi?
Delicious, boo-boo.
Delicious?
Right, boob. When something's...
He was smarter than the average bear. That was the joke. That was always the joke. But here is what nobody tells you: Yogi Bear was also smarter than the average cartoon, and the people who owned him spent 40 years proving they had absolutely no idea what that meant. At his peak, Yogi Bear was the most popular animated character in America. More popular than Bugs Bunny in television ratings. More popular than Mickey Mouse in Saturday morning viewership. A bear in a collar and a pork pie hat who stole picnic baskets in Yellowstone Park was the biggest thing in animation. And then the corporation that controlled him slowly and methodically dismantled everything that made him work until nothing was left but the hat. This is the story of how that happened. And it is stranger and sadder than you are expecting. Before we dive into video, please subscribe to our channel. The origin of Yogi Bear is inseparable from the origin of Hanna-Barbera itself, because Yogi was not simply the studio's first breakout character. He was the proof of concept that convinced an entire industry that television animation was a viable business. William Hanna and Joseph Barbera had left MGM in 1957 after the studio shut down its animation department, and the two men who had spent 17 years creating Tom and Jerry found themselves building a new studio from nothing at a moment when the economics of animation for television seemed to make the entire enterprise impossible. The theatrical animation that had defined the golden age of American cartoons required thousands of drawings per minute of finished film. Television budgets required a completely different approach. Hanna and Barbera developed what they called limited animation, a system that reduced the number of drawings required per minute by holding background static and moving only the elements of a character that needed to move for a given action. Critics who came from the theatrical tradition hated it immediately and with genuine passion. The audience did not care at all. Yogi Bear appeared first as a supporting character in the Huckleberry Hound show in 1958, and the audience response to his debut was immediate enough that Hanna and Barbera recognized within the first season that they had created something with its own gravitational pull. Yogi was not simply a funny animal character in the tradition that animation had been producing since the 1920s. He was a specific comic archetype that the medium had not previously managed to capture with this much precision. The con man who believes in his own con. The schemer whose plans are always elaborate and always wrong in exactly the way that reveals the gap between his self-image and his actual capabilities. The optimist who is constitutionally incapable of updating his worldview in response to evidence, because updating his worldview would require acknowledging that Ranger Smith has been right about everything all along, and that acknowledgement was simply not available to him. Daws Butler voiced Yogi with a specific choice that anchored the character's comedy more completely than any writing decision could have done alone. The voice was built on a foundation of Art Carney's Ed Norton from The Honeymooners, a specific New York working-class warmth that suggested a man of genuine intelligence operating at a level below his actual capability because the world he occupied had not given him the context to deploy that intelligence productively. Yogi was smarter than the average bear, and not smart enough to understand that being smarter than the average bear was an extremely low bar to clear. Butler found the precise register where those two things coexisted without either canceling the other out, and held it there across hundreds of episodes with a consistency that makes the performance seem effortless in retrospect, and was certainly not effortless in execution. Don Messick as Boo Boo was the straight man in the oldest possible comedic tradition, the voice of reason and consequence perpetually attached to someone constitutionally incapable of heeding either. Boo Boo's function in every episode was to articulate exactly why Yogi's plan was going to fail before Yogi's plan failed, and then to be present for the failure with the specific expression of a person who loves someone and cannot stop them. The relationship between Yogi and Boo Boo was not a comedy partnership in the conventional sense. It was a portrait of loyalty persisting in the face of comprehensive evidence that loyalty was not being reciprocated at an equivalent level. Boo Boo kept showing up because Boo Boo genuinely cared about what happened to Yogi, and the show never made him foolish for caring. It made him the moral center of a comedy that needed a moral center to function. Yogi Bear received his own show in 1961, and the series that Hanna-Barbera produced around the character demonstrated genuine creative confidence in what they had built. The format was simple, and the simplicity was structural rather than lazy. Yogi wanted something. Ranger Smith stood between Yogi and the thing he wanted. Yogi attempted to obtain the thing through a scheme that was always more elaborate than the situation required. The scheme failed. Yogi was returned to his starting position. The comedy lived not in the outcome, which was predetermined from the first scene, but in the specific texture of Yogi's schemes and the specific quality of Ranger Smith's exasperation and the specific warmth of Boo Boo's doomed attempts at intervention. Within this rigid format, the writers found an extraordinary amount of variation because the format was a container for character rather than a substitute for it. Ranger Smith deserves his own moment in this analysis because the character has been consistently undervalued in every discussion of the show. A lesser version of Yogi Bear would have made Ranger Smith a simple obstacle, a humorless authority figure whose function was to be defeated and humiliated. The actual Ranger Smith was something more complicated and more interesting. He was a man who was genuinely right about everything. Yogi's schemes were genuinely disruptive. The park rules Yogi violated were genuinely there for legitimate reasons. The consequences Smith predicted genuinely materialized, and who was constitutionally unable to make that rightness feel like anything other than defeat. Every time Smith caught Yogi and returned him to the starting position, he had won, and it felt like losing because Yogi's absolute refusal to accept the reality of his situation gave him a freedom that Smith's absolute investment in the reality of his situation denied him. The show understood this, and the understanding is what elevated it above the simple cat and mouse format it superficially resembled. The commercial success of Yogi Bear through the early 1960s was total. The merchandise moved in volumes that Hanna-Barbera had not projected. The character appeared across every category of children's product that licensing had developed, and the consistency of the audience response confirmed that Yogi had achieved something that animated characters rarely achieve. He had become a type rather than simply a character. When you described a person as being like Yogi Bear, everyone in the room understood immediately what you meant, and what you meant was something specific and recognizable about human nature that the character had managed to crystallize. That is what cultural permanence looks like in its early stages. That is what Hanna-Barbera then spent 4 decades failing to protect. The decline of Yogi Bear as a culturally vital character followed a pattern that would become familiar across the history of Hanna-Barbera's management of its properties. Each attempt to refresh the character's commercial relevance required removing some element of what had made the character work in the first place. Laugh Olympics in 1977 placed Yogi alongside dozens of other Hanna-Barbera characters in an athletic competition format that required him to function as a team player in a context that eliminated the specific dynamic between Yogi and Ranger Smith and Boo Boo that had always been the show's engine. Yogi without Ranger Smith is a schemer without a target. Yogi without his specific territory is a character without a world. The format that Laugh Olympics imposed on the character was not simply different from what had worked. It was specifically incompatible with what had worked because it removed the conditions that had made the comedy possible. Yogi's space race in 1978 relocated the character to outer space in a decision that reflected the cultural dominance of Star Wars without reflecting any understanding of why the Jellystone Park setting had been essential rather than incidental to the show's identity. Jellystone was not a backdrop. It was the source of the entire tension that drove every episode. The park was a place with rules and a ranger whose job was to enforce those rules and a bear whose nature was to violate those rules. And the comedy of that situation depended entirely on the specificity of that place and those rules and that ranger. Outer space had no rules that Ranger Smith could enforce. Outer space had no picnic baskets. Outer space was a setting in which nothing that made Yogi Bear interesting was available to operate. The 1988 film Yogi Bear and the Magical Flight of the Spruce Goose, and the subsequent direct-to-video productions of the late 1980s and 1990s, continued the pattern of placing Yogi in contexts that required him to behave in ways that contradicted his fundamental nature. The character who worked as a comic archetype in a contained and specific situation was repeatedly relocated into adventure plots and ensemble formats and crossover events that treated his recognizability as sufficient reason to include him, and ignored the conditions under which that recognizability had been earned. The 2010 live-action and CGI hybrid film directed by Eric Brevig was the most visible and the most complete demonstration of how thoroughly the people managing the Yogi Bear property had lost their understanding of what the property actually was. The film cast Dan Aykroyd as the voice of Yogi and Justin Timberlake as the voice of Boo Boo, and placed the characters in a plot involving a corrupt mayor attempting to sell Jellystone Park to developers. The visual execution of the CGI bears inserted into live-action environments was technically accomplished in ways that the technology of 2010 made possible and emotionally disconnected in ways that no technology could fix. The film performed adequately at the box office during the Christmas season when family films with recognizable characters reliably attract audiences regardless of quality and received reviews that accurately described what it was. A film made by people who knew what Yogi Bear looked like and did not know what Yogi Bear was. What Yogi Bear at his peak represented was a specific and irreplaceable alignment of character and setting and voice and format that produced comedy with a genuine observation of human nature sitting underneath it. The smarter than the average bear joke was not just a catchphrase. It was a precise description of the specific kind of self-delusion that makes con men sympathetic rather than merely criminal. Yogi genuinely believed he was smarter than the average bear. The evidence was consistently against him. His belief survived the evidence every single time because the belief was not based on evidence. It was based on need, and the need was what made him lovable rather than pathetic. You could not hate Yogi Bear for stealing picnic baskets because Yogi Bear stole picnic baskets with such complete conviction in his own methodology that hating him would have required hating optimism itself. That is a specific kind of comic achievement. It requires a specific kind of understanding to protect. The people who owned Yogi Bear after Hanna-Barbera's creative peak did not have that understanding, and what they produced in its absence is the shocking truth the title of this video promised. The hat remained. Everything that made the hat worth wearing was gone.